when you're looking at theory from the context that we're looking at it, you have to remember that one of the factors that plays into this is also the huge role of architecture. You have to remember that architects didn't exist prior to the late 19th century. One of my great grandfathers was one of the first British architects, apparently. And architecture really, in many ways, runs parallel with urban planning. I'm not particularly sure why. You'd have to, Jung Wah could probably explain it to you. But in that context, you have to remember that urban planning didn't exist until the late 19th century. Prior to that, cities were, pretty much entirely random. And by the mid-late 19th century, with the growth of industrialization and this whole sort of industrial revolution, cities had become, especially in Europe and the United States, cities had become these nightmares of pollution, and the actual lifespan had dropped if you lived in a city. And it's in that context that you have to remember that theory in the behavioral sciences was very attractive to architects and urban planners, and many architects are urban planners and vice versa. So they were very interested in this idea of environmental determinism, because if you think about it, if you're an architect, you build things. If you're an urban planner, you build things, you build neighborhoods. And so in that context, the idea of being able to shape behavior by virtue of structure became a central part of architecture, and still is. Many architects are in the business, at least in part, with the idea that they can make sort of a permanent stamp on the world around them by virtue of the buildings that they put in, with the concept that the buildings will then shape the behavior of the residents or people that use them. It's a huge area of architecture, always has been, and it's entirely embedded with this idea of environmental determinism. Because you have to remember, environmental determinism isn't just your climatic variation. It's not like just living in Hawaii. It's very much also the structures that you put up. So to a certain extent, for example, Chaminade's campus, the Chaminade St. Louis campus, is a built environment that was supposed to actually shape the behavior of the students. So this is a huge area of architecture and urban design. And of course, when out of this becomes interior design, which pretty much is a late 20th century, discipline, even more so, you get this idea that basically an interior designer can shape the behavior of the consumer / occupants by virtue of the things, the way that they lay out the interiors, the things that are in the interiors. And the classic discussion, if you want to think about this, would be the whole idea of the open plan kitchen, open plan main living area, so beloved of the 21st century so far, which is very much this idea of environmental determinism. If you open up areas, then people won't be isolated, they're going to socialize more, which, sounds good in theory until you suddenly add the idea of the, smartphone to that, at which point the whole thing sort of goes poke. So environmental determinism, again, you have to remember, as I mentioned last time, theories are usually generated within a particular discipline or set of disciplines, but they're very, very frequently borrowed and oftentimes have a longer shelf life outside of the disciplines that came up with them, in other disciplines that find them useful either as rationales or justifications or whatever's for things that they already want to do. And architecture, urban planning is great for borrowing both environmental determinism and also the one I want to look at now, which is functionalism. Functionalism starts up as a reaction to sociobiology and social evolution. Both of those were obviously incredibly biased, incredibly skewed, and usually incredibly ethnocentric. And so what you got was as the intellectual disciplines, if you want to have sort of universities, became more and more tied to the idea of data and rational thought. What happens then is that you want to have things that you can measure, and you can't measure sociobiology, and you can't measure social environmental determinism. So what happens is they move to things that can be, quote, quantified. And I use this in quotes because quantification is also, of course, as we were looked at earlier, is actually a form of bias, what you choose to quantify and what you choose to ignore. But this is the huge, very powerful school of what we call functionalism. This still drives most of the disciplines in the Euro-American academic, regime. They very much are functional approaches. In fact, I would argue that modern education, as we see it in the 21st century, has become increasingly functional with the idea that somehow you can relate knowledge and learning to testing and sampling, which I find is incredibly naive and not particularly logical. But functionalism in a very basic way is the idea that anything that is done within a culture, and in our case, anything that's built or something like that, will have a functional relationship. And you can actually measure that. So if you have if you put in a parking lot, the idea that the parking lot is for the purpose of storing cars and moving foot traffic into a shopping mall or something like that would be an example of a functional design. And you hear the word all the time, functional and functional design, functionalism. But the key here is the idea that the thing that you make, the thing that you use, or the thing that you're measuring, has a very clear relationship with some particular goal, and that goal is measurable, and that goal is the only goal. So when you're looking at a parking lot, for example, the argument would be, if you're from a functional standpoint, is the purpose of the parking lot is to park cars and therefore drive foot traffic to shop at the shops and then the parking lot is attached to. That's not inaccurate. And this is the key part that makes functionalism sort of dangerous. Functionalism is usually accurate up to a point. A large proportion of the stuff that we do in the world around us and interact with can be measured functionally, and it has a functional pragmatic component to it. But the idea that that's the only component is where functionalism becomes very dangerous, because you tend to ignore the other functions, for example, of a parking lot. What does the parking lot get used for after hours? Maybe folks are, drag racing mopeds or something on it. Maybe it's for drug deals. Maybe it's just for people hanging out to look good. Maybe it's entirely nothing, but the neighborhood's nervous because now you've got this large parking lot without many lights, and it sort of scares people. In other words, the actual other impacts of the parking lot that weren't part of the original sort of pragmatic purpose don't mean they don't exist. It just wasn't designed. It wasn't thought of when they designed it. And let me pause for a second and go fish this up, because I'm not sure if I'm switching panels directly. We'll see an example right here.